Welcome everyone to how to evaluate genealogical record hints. And I think, of course, we have to explain what I'm talking about in case someone has not used one of the bigger, large websites or has been ignoring those record hints. Record hints are searches done by each of the websites. And the ones that are most prominent with record hints are Ancestry and Family Search and MyHeritage and Find My Past, although there are some other websites that have these kinds of record hints. What you may not know about the record hints is that they're generated by the same kind of artificial intelligence kind of researching that's being done with what are called chatbots, the interactive websites that have come online like Chat GPT and Google Gemini and Microsoft Copilot and quite a few others. Now they're popping up in various different areas of the internet. But these record hints have, in a sense, basically made genealogy a lot more interesting, a lot more doable from the kind of beginning standpoint, and it makes it fairly simple to proceed and get quite a substantial family tree. But we're going to talk a little bit about there are a lot of cautions with record hints. They're not 100% accurate, maybe have a really high level of accuracy, but we need to go through and check them, and that's what we'll talk about today. So here's an example of a screen that occurs sometimes on the startup screen. If your startup screen happens to have this on Family Search, you may see a list of your ancestors or relatives that are marked with this blue dot. That means that they have record hints. It was an interesting too, because for many years now, MyHeritage has always called them record matches. And of course, Ancestry has marked them by little green leaves. And so those have become synonymous with record hints on Ancestry. It was interesting at Roots Tech this past week, and this Sunday class is coming about a week after Roots Tech, that MyHeritage has decided to have record hints. They're not giving up record matches, but they're actually dividing off some of the record matches and calling them record hints, and they're different and going to differentiate between the two. So there's always something changing that will make some difference. Suffice it to say that the big websites have relied on these, and a lot of people doing research now rely on these to get very practical and very valuable information out of the databases without doing a whole lot of searching, because they do all the searching for you. As I mentioned, record hints are valuable. I would say they are as valuable as gold to doing research in genealogy, but they need to be checked for accuracy. Absolutely need to look at them. If you're thinking it's kind of a busy work thing where you go in and look at the record hints and attach them all to the people that are listed, you're probably going to be guaranteed to attach record hints that don't match the people at all. So if you've done that, I would suggest you take the time to look carefully at each record hint and make sure that applies to the person that it says it applies to. And I can tell you from let's say extensive experience and having dealt with thousands of those record hints now, that there is a percentage of them that just don't apply at all, or you don't have enough information to determine if it's the right person or not from the record hint. Just because the name matches, or even if the name and place matches, that doesn't mean that it's always the right person. To begin with, the hints must match for place, time, name, and reasonableness. And reasonableness is first. Place is always high up there on the list, if not the first place that we look for matching people and doing research. And time and name are also important, but not nearly as important as the place and the reasonableness of the record match. Here you can see that there's a record match way down in the right-hand corner of the screen. It says Anthril killed Bruce Morgan has a a record match to a find a grave index. So first of all, you're given notice of where it's coming from. And if you're looking at that carefully, you'll realize that it's an index. That does not mean it's coming from the Find a Grave website. It's not coming from the complete information that's located on findagrave.com. It just basically is something that is suggestion. Let's take it as a record hint, as a suggestion. So let's look and see how that one works out. Here it is. I've clicked on the record hint here, and it brings up some more information. But it also says in the middle, view on www.findagrave.com. So, of course, the first issue is it accurate? So let's look at this a little further and see what happens with this particular one. Now, first of all, you might think that Anne Threlkeld Bruce is an unusual name, but if you look carefully at what's in Family Search and you look at this record hint, you'll see, number one, there's a spelling difference between the middle name Threlkeld and Threlkeld. So is that significant? I would have to say probably. And that's something we have to consider. Also, you'll see that the Find a Grave Index has a married name, arguably, Anne Threlkeld Bruce Morgan. Now, if you think about this for a little while, you'll realize that if this person, Anne Threlkeld Bruce, who was in the family tree already, and we'll call this one CHM, because that's if you look at the ID number right under where it says the word Bruce, you'll see the ID number from Family Search. And when you have multiple people with the same name, the way I do it is to refer to them by the last three letters or numbers or letters of their ID number. So we have Anne Threlkeld Bruce CHM. So that's the person we're going to be dealing with. And the issue here, of course, is whether the Anne Threlkeld Bruce Morgan is the same person. And the first step, of course, would determine whether or not this is someone named Morgan who just happened to be named after an ancestor named Anne Threlkeld Bruce, or whether this is someone who this is a record for the same person. So that's where we're going to have to live. So the first consideration here is that unless you're very familiar with this relative before adding a record hint, you need to take some time to look at the family. So we have 10 children listed for William Franklin Morgan. Now that's an indication that Anne Threlkeld Bruce Morgan may be the person in that Find a Grave record. But we learned that her father's name was Bruce, obviously, from her, and her mother's name was Threlkeld, which basically is a very common practice. In fact, even my own siblings and some of my grandchildren who incorporate names of grandparents. That's entirely possible, or parents. My middle name is the same as my grandfather, who I never knew because who died before I was born. There's always things like that. So you're kind of looking to see if there's patterns here. And so we're going to look at the list of children. And you'll recall that one of the criteria that I was talking about initially was reasonableness. That means, does this really make sense? Through all of these numbers, names, and places and things all make sense. So this, without doing anything more, we can see that William Franklin and his wife Anne were married in, according to a record, in 10 April of 1838 in Fleming, Kentucky. That's entirely possible, given the dates of Kentucky statehood of 1792. And we could check on Fleming. We'll do that, of course. That's important because we're looking at the consistency for places. So if we go in there and look closely, we'll see some things that we need to be aware of. First of all, we're going to match and compare the existing information, which here in this slide is on the left-hand side. That's the actual entry on the family search family tree. And on the right-hand side is a summary of what's in the index record from Find a Grave. And without going to the original Find a Grave website, this is an index. That means it's been an extracted record. There's a step between, actually two steps. There's the step of obtaining the original record from the cemetery record for Find a Grave, and that's entered into the Find a Grave website. And then this is an index of the Find a Grave website with this information extracted from the Find a Grave record. So here we go. We have a birth in Fleming, Kentucky. I'd note with Fleming, Kentucky on the left-hand side, it said there's no birthplace on the record side, the Find a Grave side of the record of the slide. We have a birth date of 9 June 1818. The names are spelled differently. In this case, the dates are different. They're off by 5 years and 1 day. There's a 10 June 1813 and a 9 June 1818, which immediately raises a flag of concern, because what if these two people were born 5 years apart? It's very possible that they had the same names, and that either we've got the wrong Anne Threckeld Bruce married to William Morgan, or we have another Anne Threckeld Bruce Morgan who either was or was not related to the original one. And one way you can get a good feel for this is to do a search for the name in Family Search. Just put in the name and don't put in a date, and search on the name and see how many people come up in Family Search with that same name. In this case, you'll find out pages of people with exactly the same name and different dates and places for birth and death. So it is not as easy as it looks when you just first see this and say, of course, this is the same person because the death date matches. And well, does the death date match? That we already know the birth date doesn't match. Oh yeah, this does match. So there's a whole slew of reasons why they could match, and that is that this record had already been looked at by someone, and the information had been entered by that. We'll get to sources here in just a minute, but this is the initial kinds of things that we're going to be concerned about. Now, if you thought it was as straightforward as, yeah, straight matches, click, clock, attach that, we've got that information, then how do you resolve the birth dates, the name spelling, and the other items here? By the way, the spelling of names back in that time period, let's say the 1800s, was very much a matter of change. In other words, even if your name was spelled the same, there were many times when the same person would sign their name differently and spell it differently in different times when it was signed. So I wouldn't put too much weight on the name difference, but the birth date difference is a little bit bothersome, and we want to know what else there is that might help us to decide, despite that, whatever difference in dates, that this is whether there's an actual date. So I guess the first step here is we're going to look at the original document. Now, the document in this case is the Find a Grave entry, which is in findagrave.com. We can go to that directly from the index in Family Search, the index record that comes up, and that'll take us right to the website. So here's the Find a Grave entry. There's a picture of the Morgan tombstone or grave marker, which is the more generic term. And Anne Threckeld, you can't read it unless you're looking at it very closely. Anne Threckeld Morgan is listed as the wife, and there's dates on it, on the grave marker. And by the way, the birth date that's listed here on on the actual website is 10 June 1818, which the number that's in the family search entry. So if we pull that up big so you can see it, that's the number that's on the grave marker. So first, that may answer at this point the difference between the two dates in the entry and the record as it came up in family search, but it may give you an indication of the reasonableness and the reliability of record hints by noting that it was probably an entry error when the index was made. So reading that, someone read that 1818 as 1813, which is a common error, by the way. So the 1918 has the date. So I'm assuming that there's a transcription error in family search. So we found a transcription error. We shouldn't be wringing our hands and throwing it all away and saying, oh. But we need to remember that we go through this process to actually determine what part of the information is correct and what can we rely on as the record is set. Some of the other information here, obviously, except for the spelling on the name, also agree. By the way, the record is not quite as unknown as it did. Now, what happens when we get to some of the sources? So we're going to jump to a source. And this is a source that's attached to Anne Morgan. And it says the date and it gives a birth year estimate of 1819. And given that estimating a date from an age and using a census record has a tendency to be at least 1 year off on most occasions. And that's because the census information is taken on a certain date of the year, usually during the summer, and the person may have been born in the spring or in the fall. If they're born in the spring, then they're, for example, they could have been 50 years old. If they're born in the fall, they could have been 51 years old, or 51 years old in the spring and 52 years old in the fall. So it depends on the date that the actual birth date and the date of the census record. So here we are. That seems to collaborate from that standpoint of the sort of 1 year inaccuracy of an 1818 birth date. And we can then go on and find out if there's any other information that needs to be that's collaborative. So we're going to say, is there a source more reliable than find a grave for the birth date? So an understanding that find a grave is not an original source. It's an extracted record. It's similar to any other subtracted records. Indexes are extracted records. Find a grave is just more like an index or a source, finding source for cemeteries and grave markers and information. And so the question is there anything else that we could use to collaborate or determine? We have a very specific date of birth, and there's always the possibility if someone bothered to enter the information into the family tree, that information came from a family Bible or directly down through the generations down from Anne Thrickle Morgan herself. So now on sources for the birth date on family search, if you click on the little pencil to edit the source, it will come up, family search comes up with records if they've been tagged, and hopefully everyone's tagging the dates on their records. So we see an 1860, 70, 80, and 1900 census. We're missing the 1890 census because it was burned and ultimately thrown away. And so basically we have a substantial amount of information from census records taken from the actual people involved. It may not be always, but very good likelihood that you could look at each one and see if they're all consistent about the birth date. And that may answer the transcript, make it even more likely that there was a transcription error. There's some more information. There's a death date. And then, of course, we've got the find a grave index with the 1813 date. So why is that a concern? I mean, one way or the other, there's a problem. In other words, it seems right now that the issue was one of transcription, but we're still not to the point where we've determined that there isn't another person with that date. We're not doubting that the person there's a little bit of, with a grave marker, there's a higher level of reliability than an index. And so the fact that we have a grave marker with that 1818 date, we have two different dates, a June 1818 and a June 1813. So the question is, are they the same person? Still, you'd say, well, why are we going on and on with this? Because we really could have made that decision a long time ago and just forgot it. And if there's a discrepancy, it's a discrepancy and it's not that big a deal, and on and on. The road to ignoring these records and ignoring the process leads to starting people off on the wrong person, or in a sense, when you add a record that is you haven't formally merged the people, but you've done the same thing, because when you start putting records in that aren't the same people, it becomes a very confusing affair. So why does Family Search have the 1913 date? I'm going to guess that it was a transcription error. So we're going to look here to see some additional information to see what we can, how consistent all this is. And we're moving now beyond the focusing solely at the person involved. In this case, we have a record, find a grave record, that gives a birth date and a death date. And so now what we want to know, is this reasonable? And is it accurately represented by the children involved here? So we have 10 children. That's quite a bit to work with. And the dates there, 39, 42. So let's kind of look at all the dates here for a second and see how they come out. We've got the marriage on 10 April 1838, first birth 1839, it's reasonable. And then we have a birth at 1861. We'll see if that's reasonable. So the children were born between 1839 and 1861. And so she was either, with dates given, the two different dates, she was either 43 years old or 48 years old on the birth date of the last child. That's still reasonable. It's possible. 48 starts to push the issue quite a bit. 43 is more likely. Both of them are sort of up there, but there's question is this James Morgan actually a child of that marriage? And there's 10 children here. So even in those days, in the old days, in the 1800s, it's a family of 10 children was a little bit outside the total of the average. So she was either 25 or 20 when she got married. Now, I'm not saying that all of the dates here for Anne are unreasonable. I'm simply saying these are the factors that you look at to determine whether or not a record hand is accurate enough to attach. And if it's not, you don't attach it, because it's going to be misleading if it's the wrong person, or if the information that's given there is too far inaccurate. Now, if it's just off because somebody said it was about that date, that's different. But here we have dates that are represented as being specific. And so from that standpoint, we need to know how accurate one or the other is. So what happens with all this? Let's see. So let's compare where each of the children were born with the birthplace, marriage place, and death place of the mother. Okay, here we're looking at the rule of first rule of genealogy, which is that when the baby was born, the mother was there, present, the time of the birth. Okay, so that's the first rule. And are we going to, is it going to be the fact that the mother couldn't have been there at the time of the birth or not? So let's kind of go through the children. Let's see where the children were born as compared to where the mother lived. And we have like Lucinda born, and we have some others. And so let's see if the Moorfield Nicholas, and she's, of course, this is a child who's who dies in Los Angeles. That's in 1936. That's entirely possible. So we're not worried about that date. But we are worried about the dates that are associated with being part of the family and where the mother was. And we know that she was born in Fleming, Kentucky. And so far, we don't have a death, but I'm going to understand that she actually died in Illinois. So here's Moorfield, and here's Fleming. And we are actually, if you look at the scale on the map, this is only about 2 miles away. So we are basically within no question that it was possible that this one child could be born in Moorfield and the other children in the family could have been living up in Fleming. So when we check the birthplaces of all the children, we'll see if there's any issues with the family that need to be addressed. Now, where is this coming from? The record on the Find-A-Grave? Well, if you didn't look at the Find-A-Grave, it lists the children. And so we're going to go a little bit further to see, as we add that, do we add the Find-A-Grave to each of the children, or do we find out that the children are wrong, or what's the problem here? And so one of the rules, of course, is that when we add a source, like coming from a record hand, that we're going to basically look at all the children, because we need to know whether each of the children have to have that if they're mentioned in that record, in which they are, as a matter of fact. So we'll look at each of these children now. As we go down, we look at where they were born. We look at the dates. I know it's going a little faster than you can pick up dates, but they're pretty much consistent. And if you'd run each of these, you'll find that that's where they are. Okay, so here's a birth in 1861 in or possibly it says of Lynn, Essex, Massachusetts. Now that means that whoever entered this entry believed that the person was born in Lynn, Essex, Massachusetts, if there was something else, and died in Pasadena, California. Now, that's still possible in 1955, but we're talking about something that's not just a couple of miles away from Fleming, Kentucky. So now we're going to look and see. Actually, even though it went very fast past, I looked at it and there was the last few children that may not be part of this family. So we still have to look at these children to see whether the information that is on the Find-A-Grave record, the record hand, is reliable. Okay, now I'm talking through this. And as I go, I'm touching base with all of the different concerns that I have. So how much time does this actually take to do? Because by the time we get finished, we'll probably have spent almost an hour on this one record. Then am I going to spend an hour on each of the records that I find as record hints? The answer to that is no. If there's no controversy and there's no issue and you already know a lot about the family, then all of this information is going to go click, 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 and we're going to be done with it. But in this case, what happens here is that it may or may not be correct here. Plus, I'm assuming that you're probably in the position that many people are when they find a record match for somebody like this, unless they've entered all that information previously by themselves, they're relying on maybe 10 different people who put in 10 different children. And to say that all of these, or just assume that all of these are correct and attach the record to each person is, basically not going to happen and not going to be helpful. So this is what we're looking at. And here we are, we're working here with something that is, this is an obvious problem, because James Morgan, who was born in 1861 in Massachusetts, is not going to be the same as a child of William Franklin and Anne Threckle Bruce, who were in Kentucky. So we go through this and we find out, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there's no death information yet in the family search. So there aren't any sources here that tell where she died or when. Where did the information come from that she died? Those are questions. There's a record for Anne in the 1880 US Census when she's 62 years old and living in Champaign, Illinois. And then there's a record that says she dies, or at least an entry that says she dies in Champaign, Illinois. So, what we're also seeing as we go along here are areas that are open for research. And we have quite a few sources here, 17 sources, but we obviously haven't closed all of the issues that are involved with this particular person. And there's more research that could be done. Now, would I put this on high priority? Well, the answer is yes, if I ran across this and I got into it and found all those discrepancies and all the problems that were occurring here, I would probably start doing it. And I guess the basic issue behind that is, where are you doing your research? Why are you concerned about this particular person if there's already quite a bit of research that's been done? And where are you directing your research? Now, I would be doing this research if I were using this line to go back, which I am and have in other times, go back to do descendancy research. I want to make absolutely sure that each of the children and each of the parents and each of the families are correct, so that when I'm going back and back and back in time, I have a parent-child relationship for every child and parent, and I have a completely unbroken chain of connections that go back into the time frame for when I'm going to begin my descendancy. And these people are back there far enough that I would be using them as the, I call it the key top of the tree person for starting a descendancy research, because they have that many children and they have that much information. And it's not as important, and there's no order here. I mean, the way you do this is not necessarily in any fixed order. It's based on the fact that you can look at it initially, and if everything is consistent, initially it might take 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, a few minutes, depending on how fast you read, how fast you can appreciate the numbers and the differences. And what started us on this is the names are not spelled the same, and the dates were not same on this record. So that's the reason we're starting to go into this kind of an analysis. So here we are back again, and this is the one that comes up from the Find a Grave record. And it said she was buried in Urbana, Champaign County, Illinois. And that's consistent with what we saw earlier just now about where she died. So one of the things I would concern me here is, how do they get from Illinois from Kentucky? And there is a definite migratory line, historical migratory line during this part of the night in the 1800s from Kentucky into Indiana and then into Illinois, and occasionally directly into Illinois. The reason for this is availability of land and a different type of life that was being lived in Kentucky as opposed to Indiana and Illinois. So this all very, very consistent and possible. The only ones that are different now, when we get here, if we've resolved the 1813 to our satisfaction, is the record of some of the children. And let's look at what happens there. So at this point, I would go ahead and attach the record from the record hint to Anne's entry. I just do that. Now, whether all of the information is correct on the children, that is the next step. If I'm at the point where I'm going to actually look at all the children, I would. And if I'm going to attach the record to all of the children, I have to determine if the children are correct. So now we end up with, and I'm going to kind of jump ahead because there's a lot of information on all the 10 children, and that would be have to go through. And here we see that we have the last child who was supposedly born in 18 December in 1861 and died in Pasadena, California in 1955. And he married somebody called Heron Daly, and they married in 1894 and apparently never had any children, which may be highly suspect. It's very possible that there were children, but there's been quite a bit of research, and so far we don't see any children. But we have over here 5 more research helps, and 3 of those happen to be record hints. And so we're looking at some more record hints, and let's look at some of this stuff. So here he is. He's 18 December 1861 in Lynn, Essex, Massachusetts. Died in Pasadena in 1955. So is there something around here that tells his birth and birth date? And is it the same as Lynn, Essex, Massachusetts, or is they've just ignored the records and sources and haven't entered the information in the family search, or is there something else, or is this a different person and he's not even part of the family? By the way, James Morgan is an extremely common name. We look at the 1870 census, which we have already had attached, and we find that we have a James Morgan, 8 years old, who's part of the family, and he's living in Champaign, Illinois. And if you're from Champaign, Illinois, I may not be saying it correctly, but I can assume that if you came to Utah, you would probably mispronounce half of the town names in the state. So I'm sorry if I'm not correctly pronouncing that particular place name. There's a passport application source for James Morgan, born in Kentucky also. So let's see what that says. And we've got other things. So we have a newspaper obituary. We have a passport application. We have more newspaper. And here it says that Morgan died in May 22nd, and his wife's name was Maddie Helen Daly, wife of the late James Morgan, and the road and the place and in Lynn, and he's 90 years old. And so, we're pretty much sure where he was, and he was, and then we still don't know from the obituary where he was born. But we can look at additional records. So he has 4 record hints. Actually, only 3 of them are actual record hints. They're telling you to get going. And one of them gives the information. So here we have a summary of those record hints. And when we look at the passport application, we see that he was born in Fleming County, Kentucky. That's a giveaway. He's the right person. Is the rest of the information correct? Seems to support that he's the same person who was born to William Morgan, so the entry in the family tree needs to be changed. That of Essex, Massachusetts entry is inaccurate, and we can actually put where this record was already attached. It wasn't like we had to do any research. All we had to do was look at the record, and we got that information corrected. And we also have a way to see whether this person had any children. So if we're interested in doing some descendancy research, we can find out from this information that he had children. And it's important to note that this record hint that we got from a passport application is not a record that most of the researchers would have found easily or even at all without the record hint, because the only way you're going to find it is if it comes up as a record that would be listed if you went to search for this person. And with the information that we have, It's very likely on a search on Family Search or some of the other websites that this particular record would be way, way down on a list of people who would be responding to a record hit. Now, what we would hope is that with the development of artificial intelligence or AI, that these records would become more available and they'd be more susceptible to being found. And I found that to be the case already. That's actually what's happening. But right now, if we find that there's a record hint, then we are been given this kind of as a gift, that we now have this record that we would never have found otherwise, most likely. So here we are with the information, and there's a lot more information on this. It's not just simply limited to that information. So now, what else could we do? Well, if you do like I commonly do when I'm doing research in English-speaking countries, I include ancestry and on occasion find my past, and in a lot of cases, my heritage, all four of the websites as places to look for information on the family. So if we're really interested in doing some genealogy, we'd be really interested in this entry in the family tree for James Morgan, because he has no children listed. Now, because I've featured him on this class, I would assume that somebody'd rush out and do that. But if they don't, at some point, of course, I will go out and do the research and add some more names. Or find out that they never had children and he died without any children, in which case that's the end of the entry right there. And those two possibilities could be answered by looking at all of the census records, which would only give you if there was never a child born in between two and died before in between two census records, but it is an indication. And the obituaries and other things may be possible. It turns out that this person is fairly well known and was prominent in his particular occupational field. So he has 14 waiting record hints on Ancestry. So by pulling up Ancestry, having your tree built out in Ancestry to the point where you're doing research in the family tree on Family Search, and using the record hints on Ancestry, you've just been given a gift of 14 additional record hints. And you'll be able to see if those all apply. And if they do, you may be answering all the questions that you needed to answer when you had all of the records from Ancestry and all of the records from Family Search before you, which may exceed the number. These may not be duplicate records, all of them. There may be some duplicates for records that are on Family Search, but even if they're not, but to bear in mind that when we're adding sources, we're adding places where the record can be found. And the fact that you have two records that are the same, like the same census record, if they come from one from Family Search and one from Ancestry, then they're not the same record. There's two different records there, even if they contain the same content and their same census records. We're talking about where we could find the records if we needed to go back and do the research again. So there's the 14 hints, and here's what they look like listed out on Ancestry. You work your way down through that, and you've got possibly considerably more information you would be adding to James Morgan, much less to it for his families. Of course, some of these records will mention his siblings and his parents, and so they will add additional family information. It may clear up all the issues that we have. So had I been using Ancestry with Family Search, I would have been able to solve this problem before it ever occurred. In other words, if I was working through as I do now, I do my initial research on Ancestry along with Family Search. So I have the people that I've already got in Family Search. If I'm just going back through to verify them, I will do all of the research first on Ancestry or my heritage or find my past. And then when I've got all the information correct on Family Search, I can rely much more completely upon the information and go back in time and make good decisions, and be assured that I'm not spending a whole lot of time on people that I'm not related to. So I always suggest it's a good idea to work in tandem with Family Search and Ancestry. I would suggest it's also helpful to add in, if you're doing English records or British Empire records, former British Empire records, then doing records with Find My Past also, and adding in My Heritage. Of course, if you get away from English language countries where the English was the predominant language, you're going to be using My Heritage more frequently than you are some of the other websites. And by the way, this record gives this vital record here gives his birthday, approximately a marriage date, and his wife's maiden name. So now we can rely on that. And here's a record hint from Ancestry. There are 4 ones on one of his, another one. This is completely not related to the other people that we were just looking at, the Morgan family. This is a different family. And when I got into the Family Search family tree, there is no information. I have a name, but I don't have anything else. And here we have 4 record hints. So by using this as in tandem at the same time as I'm looking for research on Family Search, as I am on Ancestry, I've just been given a leg up so I can get over this fence and get moving on with more information about this particular family. And as we put information in both the records, or all 3 of the records, or all 4 of the records, then we generate even more information. So if you're using just one of these websites at a time and not looking at the other websites at the same time that you're doing the research, you're basically not, it's like you're walking in and you bought 4 things and they were going to give you 10 things for free, and you didn't even want to know that. So this person, this one that I'm working on, is a different person. I have an 1861 census showing the family, and that came up initially with him, who I had no records for in the Family Search family tree. So now I have him and some children and a wife. So that's pretty fast research for simply opening up another program. And of course, if there's a cost, there's costs, there are paywalls for some of these programs. Family Search, not as free, but Ancestry and Find My Past and My Heritage are free. But it just depends on your level. If you're wanting to spend a minimal amount of time and you have the dollars to spend for the additional subscriptions, it's well worth the money. And it just where you want to put your money and where your interests are. So when I add My Heritage to the mix, then I have a family tree on My Heritage, and I can get additional sources and matches. Right now, every one of those brown dots on every one of those people is a record match for or record match on My Heritage, or maybe a record hint that they call it now, on each of those people. So if I were doing research here on my Danish line, I would be doing it in My Heritage, because that's where all those record matches are located. So all those brown dots are record matches. This is a record match from Philae, and it references the Family Search family tree. So you want to avoid getting in a circle. So Philae copies this information from the Family Search family tree and then puts it up as a record match on Philae. And so we're kind of going around in a circle here, and we're not really getting any more of any greater reliability than we would be if we did the real research. So just be cautious about adding in information that's found by other websites, and then especially if they're attributed to Family Search. So you have to decide if you want to include these other record hints from other family trees. Sometimes they're useful to get you started, But I usually consider most record matches to a family tree as being user submitted, and unless there are other sources basically supporting the information that's being given from this other family tree, I don't usually look at them. I don't want to be misled by someone that just entered information without having a source. And so I don't usually look at them unless I just absolutely have no other choice. And then I look and I try to see if there is actually any way that they could be correct. So I'll just summarize this as saying I don't attach these entries as sources. And I most of the time detach them if they've been added when they contain no new or original information. So it's not a source if it just is a copied name from some other website. So here's for example, for one of my ancestors, here's a MyHeritage list of record matches. And there's one that's here from the England Wales Birth Index, which is an index. We have a Billion Graves record, which tells where he was buried in Arizona. And then we have England births and christenings, and we have Genie. So we have a mixture of different kinds of records. Not all of these would be records that I would automatically add or even spend time trying to add. If you add additional records from record hints on or matches on MyHeritage, now either one of those is correct today, like I mentioned at the beginning. MyHeritage now has record matches and record hints. So you can say either one and not be totally wrong. Like it's difficult to keep that straight. But here, there's another part of MyHeritage, and that is Record Detective, which automatically, if you look at one of the records, would then come out and pull up additional records. And that just seems to keep magnifying until I have, in cases, hundreds of extra records. So I'd kind of summarize this to say that record hints can become a distraction. If you focus only on record hints and not on your ultimate research objectives and what you really need to know, and you're just adding in record hints, then that's probably valuable to someone at some time, but not necessarily productive as far as extending lines or either descendancy or ascendancy lines. So if everybody's sufficiently documented, I would make sure that you're doing additional research on a specific person for some reason. And the reason being that the information appeared to be initially contradictory and not correct. So don't add a record hint unless you closely examine the original source. Just be basic. From what you've seen here, the record that came up had been arguably transcribed incorrectly from the original source. The original source was not inconsistent, and it gave us additional information that we're able to use to try to verify the children and other things. So looking at the original record is just automatically should be part of the process of doing this. And also remember that the locations are always the most important thing, that it has to be reasonable with the location. You can't have children born in England a week or two after children are born in America and things like that, which I've seen and comes up regularly as an issue. One of my ancestors who lived in northern Arizona died in northern Arizona, and the mother probably never left her home once she settled there in 1877. And so when they're showing children born in England, it's not even physically possible that happened. So keep learning. Don't become dependent on record hints. Learn how to do the research even if you can't see or don't have any record hints.
There is a question in the Q&A from Dana Morrison. She says, I would like to learn more about the Family Search Lab's full text search. Will you have a future class that goes in depth about that?
Yes, and I'm writing it right now. That will be part of a class I have scheduled in the next couple of weeks, actually. I'm only that far ahead now. Thanks for watching.